Lysandra's wedding chest hit the stone floor so hard that the silver clasp snapped open, spilling her folded nightgown, bridal ribbons, and the small embroidered shoes her mother had once given her across the corridor like discarded trash. For one stunned heartbeat, nobody moved. Then another servant dragged the second chest from the bridal chamber and shoved it against the wall beneath the watching eyes of nearly 30 nobles, guards, and palace maids who had not yet left the celebration. Mira, Lysandra's personal maid, was on her knees beside the door with blood at the corner of her mouth, 2 guards holding her shoulders down because she had tried to stop them. Above the doorway, a servant was removing the polished silver plaque that had been engraved that morning with the words, Luna Lysandra. The wedding feast had ended less than an hour ago. Her vows were still warm in her memory, yet Blackthorn was already erasing her from her own marriage. Lysandra did not ask what had happened. She already knew something far worse than an argument waited beyond that door. She stepped over the fallen contents of her chest, her white ceremonial gown whispering over the cold floor, and entered the chamber that had been blessed for her union with Alpha King Kael Draven. The sight inside struck harder than any slap could have. Seraphine Vera was stretched across the bridal bed, with one arm curled possessively around Kael's neck. She wore a crimson sleeping gown, and over it, the silver Luna cloak that had been prepared for Lysandra alone. Her bare feet rested on the embroidered blanket bearing Moonveil's crest. Kael sat beside her with his wedding tunic loosened at the collar, one hand still resting on Seraphine's waist. Neither of them looked surprised. That was the moment Lysandra understood this humiliation had not happened accidentally. It had been prepared for her. Seraphine lifted the silver goblet, engraved with Lysandra's new royal name, and took a slow drink before meeting the bride's eyes. Satisfaction shone openly across her face. "Sleep somewhere else tonight," she said, as casually as though dismissing a servant from a kitchen. "The king has already decided who belongs in this room." The corridor behind Lysandra went silent. Nobody laughed this time. The insult was too naked, even for people who had spent years flattering Seraphine. Lysandra looked past her and fixed her gaze on Kael. She waited for him to stand, to order Seraphine out, to show even the smallest sign that the vows he had spoken before the moon altar meant something once the witnesses were gone. Kael did none of those things. Instead, irritation tightened his features, as though Lysandra's presence was the problem that needed solving. "Tell her to leave," Lysandra said. Her voice was low, but it carried clearly through the room. Seraphine's smile disappeared for half a second. Kael exhaled slowly and rose, though he still did not move away from his mistress. "Do not turn this into a public spectacle," Lysandra almost laughed from the cruelty of it. Her belongings were scattered through the corridor. Her maid had been struck. Another woman wore her Luna cloak, and somehow she was the one creating a spectacle. Kyle stepped closer. "Seraphine has stood beside me through wars you know nothing about. She has earned consideration." Lysandra stared at him. "And what did I earn when I stood beside you before the moon goddess less than an hour ago?" His jaw hardened. "A crown. Protection for Moonveil. A place in this kingdom. Do not embarrass me over a bed." The words cut through something inside her that could never be stitched together again. "A bed?" Lysandra repeated, almost too softly to hear. Seraphine rose then, delighted by Kael's defense, and walked toward them wearing Lysandra's cloak like a trophy. "Perhaps she still does not understand how Blackthorn works," she said. "A title may make you his wife in front of the council, but it does not make you the woman he wants when the doors close." She reached for the silver Luna pendant hanging at Lysandra's throat. Before Lysandra could step away, Seraphine hooked one finger beneath the chain and tore it free. The clasp snapped. The pendant fell, but Lysandra caught it in her palm, the jagged chain slicing her skin. Blood slid between her fingers. Seraphine only smiled. "It looks wrong on you anyway." Lysandra's hand moved before thought could stop it. She caught Seraphine by the wrist when the woman reached for the pendant again. The entire room froze. Seraphine gasped theatrically, but Kael reacted instantly. His fingers closed around Lysandra's wrist with enough force to hurt. Not Seraphine's. Hers. "Release her." Lysandra turned slowly toward him. Kael was protecting his mistress from his own wife while Lysandra's blood was still dripping onto the floor. "She tore the Luna chain from my neck." "And you are still making this worse," Kael answered. Then came the humiliation that finally killed whatever remained of her hope. "Apologize to Seraphine." Mira made a broken sound from the corridor. Several nobles looked away. Lysandra felt as though the entire palace had watched Kale strip her dignity from her piece by piece, then demand she thank him for leaving anything behind. She pulled her wrist free. "If I walk away from this room tonight," she asked, "are you certain you will find me here tomorrow?" Something flickered in Kale's eyes, but arrogance buried it almost immediately. "Moonvale has barely recovered from famine. Your border is protected by my soldiers. Your council begged for this alliance." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Do not pretend you have somewhere better to go." Seraphine's lips curved again. Kale continued, more certain with every word. "You are my wife by treaty, Lysandra. Be angry if you wish, cry if you must, but when the sun rises, you will still be in Blackthorn." Lysandra looked at him for a long moment. She did not shout. She did not slap Seraphine. She did not beg the man she had just married to remember his vows. Something colder and stronger than rage settled inside her. "Then sleep well, your majesty." 3 days earlier, Blackthorn had welcomed her beneath ringing bells and raised banners. Lysandra had entered believing duty might eventually grow into respect, perhaps even something warmer. The first sign that fate had brought her there for reasons greater than a treaty came at the northern gate. Ancient moonstones embedded in the arch had been dark for nearly 20 years, yet the moment her horse crossed beneath them, silver light exploded across the stone. Soldiers stepped back. High Priestess Elowen went pale. Seraphine, standing beside Kale, had looked not surprised, but frightened. From that moment the attacks began, Seraphine stealing Lysandra's seat beside Kale, wearing silver reserved for the future Luna, ordering Lysandra's maids around, and recounting intimate memories of Kale at dinner while watching Lysandra's face. Every time Lysandra objected, Kale gave the same answer. Malrek Vera controlled too many council votes. Seraphine was sensitive. Lysandra needed patience. Peace required sacrifice. Somehow the sacrifice was always hers. That morning, Mira had placed a small cedar box in Lysandra's hands, the last possession left by her mother, Althea. Inside was an old crescent medallion and a single strip of parchment. A Moonborn must never remain where her sacred bond is dishonored. Lysandra had read the sentence 3 times without understanding the strange word. Moonborn. Now, inside the cramped guest room Seraphine had ordered prepared for her, the medallion lay warm against Lysandra's palm while she finally let herself break. She pressed both hands over her mouth so nobody outside would hear the sob that tore through her. She had not expected Kale to love her, but she had believed a king who asked for her loyalty would at least defend her dignity. That belief hurt more to bury than the marriage itself. After several minutes, Lysandra wiped her face, stood, and began taking off everything Blackthorn had given her. The wedding ring went first, then the crown, then the ceremonial silver cloak. She folded each piece carefully instead of throwing them, because she refused to leave like a woman destroyed by jealousy. On top she placed one short note. "You chose where I should sleep. I chose where I will wake." Before midnight, Lysandra and Mira slipped through the northern gate with 2 horses and nothing bearing Blackthorn's crest. No gold, no escort, no royal permission. When Lysandra crossed the final boundary stone, the crescent medallion burned suddenly against her chest. Behind them, every moonstone along Blackthorn's walls went dark at once. Far inside the palace, Kale doubled over as a violent pain tore through the alpha mark above his heart. At the northern watchtower, the protective barrier collapsed. 3 patrol leaders suddenly lost their connection to the royal mind link. Still, no one understood why. At sunrise, Kale stormed into the guest chamber expecting to find a furious wife who had spent the night crying. Instead, he found silence. Her wedding ring rested on the folded Luna cloak. The room held no luggage, no Mira, no Lysandra. Then the reports arrived, one after another. Moon Valley's sacred stream had stopped flowing toward Blackthorn. The northern barrier was gone. Rogue wolves had breached an outer patrol, and several warriors could barely hear their alpha through the pack bond. Kale stared at the note until his fingers tightened around it. He reached through the newborn mate bond. "Lysandra, answer me." Nothing. He tried again, anger cracking through his control. "Return to Blackthorn. Now." Still nothing. The third attempt came differently, stripped of command, stripped of pride. "Lysandra, please answer me." Silence answered him. Behind him, High Priestess Elowen entered, saw the abandoned ring, and turned white. "Your Majesty," she whispered, "I think you did more than drive away your bride. You may have driven the last Moonborn Luna out of Blackthorn." By the time the second alarm bell rang across Blackthorn, Cale had already broken 2 goblets, dismissed 3 captains, and sent every mounted scout under his command toward the northern roads. None of it changed the fact that Lysandra was gone. The palace that had celebrated his wedding only hours earlier now felt like a wounded beast, struggling to breathe. Servants whispered that the sacred fountains had stopped flowing. Guards at the eastern tower reported that the protective runes carved into the walls were fading one after another. In the training yard, a young warrior shifted halfway into wolf form and collapsed screaming when the transformation failed. Cale stood in the center of the chaos with Lysandra's note still crushed in his fist, forced to confront a truth he had never imagined when he watched her leave that bridal chamber. She had not been bluffing, and whatever had departed with her was far more dangerous to lose than his pride. The council assembled before noon, but panic reached the chamber before Cale did. Elder Garrick demanded the northern border be reinforced. Commander Roven reported that 2 patrol groups could no longer hear the royal mind link beyond 5 miles. Another elder insisted Moon Valley's water had never failed in recorded memory. Cale entered with bloodshot eyes and ordered everyone silent, yet even his command no longer carried the same crushing force. He felt it himself. The authority that had always filled his voice like thunder now seemed to strike against invisible walls and return weakened. "Find Lysandra," he said. "Every road, every forest path, every village between here and Moonvale." Garrick stared at him. "And if she refuses to return?" Cale's expression hardened. "She is my wife." The answer sounded less convincing than he intended. Eloan, standing at the far end of the chamber, said nothing. Her silence made him angrier than any accusation. Seraphine entered wearing silver. Not merely a silver dress, but Lysandra's ceremonial shoulder chain and one of the jeweled clasps that had been removed from the bridal chamber after her departure. The sight turned several elders visibly uncomfortable, but Seraphine appeared almost exhilarated by the disorder around her. "Blackthorn needs stability," she announced, walking directly to Cale's side. The girl abandoned her duties before her first sunrise as Luna. The people cannot be expected to wait while she throws a tantrum. Cale turned slowly toward her. Only hours earlier he might have accepted the explanation. Now the empty room, the dead moonstones, and Lysandra's final silence made the word tantrum feel obscene. Still, before he could answer, Malrek Vera rose from his seat. "My daughter is right. A throne cannot remain tied to a woman who has deserted it. Name Seraphine Luna, and the council will stand behind you." Cale should have refused immediately. Instead, years of political instinct fought with the first cracks of regret inside him. Malrek controlled nearly half the council. Blackthorn's borders were weakening by the hour. If panic spread, rival packs would smell vulnerability before sunset. Cale looked at Seraphine and remembered how many wars she had stood beside him through, how many times Malrek's influence had kept rebellious elders in line. Then, unwillingly, he remembered Lysandra in the corridor, blood running across her palm, while he told her to apologize. The memory made his stomach twist. "A coronation cannot happen without the moonstone crown," he said at last. Malrek smiled faintly. "Then let the stone decide." Eloan's head snapped up. For the first time that morning, something resembling fear crossed her face. Mira was dragged into the chamber before the ritual began. 2 guards forced her to her knees at Seraphine's command, though Cale had not ordered it. Her lip was still split from the previous night, and the bruising along her cheek had darkened. "Tell us where she went," Seraphine demanded. Mira lifted her head. "I do not know where my Luna is." Seraphine struck her so hard the sound cracked across the chamber. Several elders flinched. Cale surged to his feet. "Enough." Seraphine turned, startled by the sharpness in his voice. "She helped your wife desert you." Cale stared at Mira, and for one sickening moment he saw Lysandra again. Surrounded, humiliated, expected to accept cruelty quietly because Blackthorn was stronger. Mira wiped blood from her mouth and looked directly at him. "She did not desert you, Your Majesty. She left the place where you proved she was worth less than your mistress." No one moved. Cale's face became stone. Seraphine raised her hand again, but this time he caught her wrist before she could strike. The gesture mirrored what he had done to Lysandra the night before. Only now the shame of that memory burned through him. "Do not touch her again," he said. Seraphine stared at him as though he had betrayed her. Perhaps in her mind he had. Malrek immediately intervened. "We are wasting time while the kingdom weakens." Cale released Seraphine and ordered Mira taken to a guarded room rather than the dungeon. It was not kindness enough to repair anything, and he knew it. Yet it was the first time he had stopped Seraphine instead of asking everyone else to tolerate her. That realization brought no relief. It only showed him how easily he could have done the same for Lysandra and chose not to. The moonstone crown was carried into the great hall before sunset. It had not been used in 37 years. The ancient circlet looked almost plain, forged from dark silver around a single pale stone the size of a dove's egg. Seraphine approached the altar dressed in Lysandra's colors, chin lifted proudly while Malrek watched from beside the council seats. Kale stood several steps away, rigid and silent. "Place your hand over the stone," Elowen instructed. Seraphine did so. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the moonstone turned black. A violent flash exploded through the hall. Seraphine screamed and stumbled backward, clutching her palm as smoke rose from her skin. The crown struck the floor without breaking. Gasps swept through the council. Elowen did not look surprised. "The crown has rejected her," she said. Malrek immediately shouted that the ritual had been corrupted. But fear had already entered the room. Far beyond Blackthorn's walls, Lysandra knew nothing of Seraphine's humiliation. She and Mira had reached a nameless border village shortly after noon, intending only to water the horses before continuing north. Instead, they found a mother kneeling beside a feverish child while another villager carried buckets from a stream stained with gray residue. More than a dozen people were sick. Lysandra forgot her own exhaustion the moment she recognized the smell. "Do not drink from that water," she ordered, already dropping to her knees beside the child. Her mother had taught her how certain silver root fungi poisoned mountain streams after heavy rain. She spent the next 6 hours boiling water, grinding willow bark, and sending villagers into the hills for bitterleaf. No one there knew she had been crowned Luna the night before. Nobody bowed. Nobody cared whose wife she was. They simply watched a strange young woman save their children with bleeding hands and eyes that still carried the traces of a night she refused to explain. Night had nearly fallen when riders bearing the Frostfang crest entered the village. Their alpha dismounted before the others. Rowan Ashbourne was taller than Lysandra expected, broad-shouldered beneath a gray traveling cloak, with the calm authority of a man who did not need to raise his voice to be obeyed. He came carrying grain and medicine, but stopped the moment he saw the crescent medallion hanging against Lysandra's chest. His expression changed. "Where did you get that?" Lysandra instinctively covered it with one hand. "It belonged to my mother." Rowan looked at her face, then at the medallion again. Slowly, to the astonishment of everyone around them, an alpha of one of the strongest northern packs lowered himself onto one knee. Then Althea's blood survived. Lysandra's breath caught. "You knew my mother?" Rowan raised his eyes. Everyone in Frostfang knows the name Althea Moonborn. Back in Blackthorn, Kale returned alone to the tiny guest room where Lysandra had spent her final hours. He had searched it twice already, but anger had blinded him the first time. Now he noticed the cedar box beneath the bed. The inside appeared empty except for a faded lining. When he lifted it, however, the wooden base shifted. Kale broke the false bottom with his thumb. Hidden beneath it was a brittle sheet of parchment marked with names he recognized from ancient royal histories. Moonborn queens, treaty keepers, women whose bloodlines had supposedly vanished generations ago. His gaze dropped toward the final line. The handwriting changed there, newer than the rest. Lysandra Vale, last living heir of the Moonborn queens. Kale stared until the letters blurred. For the first time since dawn, true fear, not anger, not wounded pride, entered him. Elowen found him still holding the parchment. She shut the door behind her. "Tell me everything." Kale's voice was dangerously quiet. The priestess looked at the family tree, then at him. "Blackthorn never owned Moon Valley. Your ancestors were granted access because a Moonborn chose to bind her protection to the Alpha Throne. The land recognizes consent, not conquest." Kale's fingers tightened around the parchment. "I married Lysandra. The bond was sealed." "The marriage was sealed," Elowen corrected. "The protection was not ownership. A Moonborn must remain willingly. If she is dishonored and chooses to leave, the land follows her decision." Kale felt the room tilt beneath him. He had believed Moonvale depended upon Blackthorn. He had used that belief to humiliate Lysandra into obedience. The truth was unbearable. Blackthorn had been the dependent kingdom all along. Before midnight, Kale was already saddling his horse. Seraphine confronted him in the courtyard, one hand wrapped in bandages from the failed coronation. "You are going after her?" Kale did not answer. "After what she did to you?" Seraphine demanded. "She abandoned you, Kale. He finally turned. No, I told her she had nowhere to go. His voice had lost its certainty. I was wrong. For the first time, Seraphine looked afraid. Kael rode out moments later with a small guard, leaving her standing beneath the dead moonstones. From the upper gallery, Malrek watched them disappear into the darkness. When Seraphine rushed to him, panicked, he merely closed the doors behind her. If the girl returns, she whispered, the crown will never accept me. Malrek's expression remained cold. Then she must never return. Hours later, 4 riders without banners slipped through a hidden western gate. Malrek handed their captain a black leather pouch heavy with gold and a single sketch of Lysandra's face. Find the Moonborn before the king does. The assassin glanced at the drawing. Alive? Malrek looked toward the darkened moonstones above the city wall. No. He paused, then added, and make certain the body is found wearing Frostfang's steel. The Moon Temple stood beyond Frostfang territory where the mountain split into 2 black ridges, its silver roof half buried beneath centuries of snow. Lysandra had imagined something grand when Rowan spoke of it, but the temple was almost painfully quiet, as if the stone itself remembered secrets that had killed everyone who once carried them. The moment she crossed the threshold, the crescent medallion against her chest began to burn. Ancient runes carved into the pillars awakened one after another, pale light spreading through the hall until every warrior behind her stopped breathing. Rowan remained several steps away, giving her space, while an elderly woman emerged from behind the altar. Lysandra recognized High Priestess Elowen immediately and stiffened. She had left Blackthorn before Kael, apparently choosing to reach this place first. "Why are you here?" Lysandra asked. Elowen's expression was heavy with something worse than pity. "Because if I had told you the truth 3 days ago, you might never have married him." The answer struck harder than Lysandra expected. She wanted anger, something clean and sharp enough to carry. But grief arrived first. Elowen led her beneath the altar into a circular chamber lined with faded portraits of women wearing crescent crowns. At the center stood the image of a young woman with Lysandra's eyes, her mother. Not the quiet healer Lysandra remembered sitting beside a kitchen fire, but a queen dressed in moon-silver armor. Althea Vale was born, Althea Moonborn, Elowen said. She was the last publicly known heir of this bloodline. Lysandra stared at the portrait until her vision blurred. All her life she had been told her mother came from an insignificant mountain house destroyed during the old wars. Now she was standing before proof that almost everything she knew had been carefully constructed to keep her alive. "Why hide me?" she whispered. Elowen answered. Because someone had already begun killing everyone whose blood could challenge the Alpha Council. The truth unfolded in pieces, and each one made the humiliation of her wedding night feel smaller compared with what had been buried beneath it. Moonborn women had never existed merely to become wives of Alpha Kings. Their role was older than Blackthorn's throne. An Alpha commanded armies, law, and the loyalty of wolves. A Moonborn guarded the land itself, the sacred waters, the border words, the Moonstone network, the ancient bond linking the throne to the territories it claimed to protect. Neither power had been meant to dominate the other. The old covenant required willing balance. An Alpha may command 1,000 warriors, Elowen explained, but he cannot command the land to love him. Lysandra thought of Kael telling her she would still be there in the morning, because Moonvale had nowhere else to turn. The cruelty of that memory deepened now. His greatest mistake had not been sleeping beside Seraphine. It had been believing her consent was irrelevant. Rowan opened a sealed iron cabinet embedded in the temple wall and removed several bundles of letters wrapped in blackened cloth. Some bore Althea's handwriting. Others carried the seal of Blackthorn from more than 20 years earlier. Lysandra read until her hands began to shake. Her mother had discovered that military routes from Blackthorn were being leaked to enemy packs during the final years of the Northern War. She had sent repeated warnings to Kael's father. None reached him. In their place, forged letters appeared accusing Moonvale of selling information. The deception had worked perfectly. Blackthorn withdrew its soldiers from an exposed pass, believing Moonvale intended betrayal. Kael's parents traveled through that same pass days later and were ambushed. Both died. The entire kingdom blamed Moonvale. Lysandra lowered the last letter slowly. "Who changed them?" she asked, though some part of her already knew. Elowen placed a ledger on the stone table. Payments, messengers, council seals. One name appeared again and again beneath coded marks. Malrek Vera. Seraphine's father had not swung the blades that killed Kale's parents, but he had guided them toward the ambush and then built his political power upon the hatred that followed. He had spent years feeding Kale the belief that Moonvale was weak, treacherous, and fortunate to receive Blackthorn's protection. Lysandra closed her eyes. Suddenly, so many moments made sense. Kale's coldness when speaking of her homeland, his refusal to trust her counsel, the contempt beneath his promise of protection. But understanding did not excuse him. That distinction mattered. Malrek may have poisoned the ground, but Kale had still chosen every step he took across it. Boots sounded above the chamber before Lysandra could say more. Rowan's warriors immediately reached for their weapons. Kale entered alone, except for one beta who remained near the stairs. He looked as though he had ridden without stopping. Dust streaked his black cloak, and exhaustion had hollowed the anger from his face. His eyes found Lysandra before anyone else. For several seconds, neither spoke. She hated how much one part of her still remembered the man beneath the crown, the rare moments before the wedding when he had almost seemed gentle. Then she remembered his hand closing around her wrist, while Seraphine wore her cloak, and whatever softness might have survived disappeared. Kale stepped closer. Blackthorn is failing. Lysandra gave a bitter laugh. And that is the first thing you say to me? Kale stopped. Shame flashed across his face, but Lysandra was no longer willing to make discomfort easier for him. You found me because your walls are dying. Your soldiers are losing their bond. Your throne has started cracking. So tell me, Kale, if Blackthorn had remained strong after I left, would you have come? He opened his mouth, then closed it. That silence answered more honestly than any polished apology could have. Lysandra felt the wound reopen anyway. Kale finally said, I came because I was wrong. About what? She demanded. About Seraphine? About Moonvale? About believing I was too desperate to leave? Choose carefully, because you were wrong about all of them. Kale's shoulders tightened. I knew Seraphine crossed lines. I let it happen because Malrek's support kept the council stable. The admission was worse than an excuse. At least excuses sometimes came from ignorance. Lysandra stepped toward him until they were only an arm's length apart. Then hear this clearly. You did not lose me when Seraphine told me to sleep somewhere else. You lost me every time she humiliated me, and you asked me to endure it because protecting her was politically convenient. You lost me when my maid was beaten. You lost me when she tore the Luna chain from my neck, and you grabbed my wrist instead of hers. You lost me when you looked at my pain and calculated how much of it your alliance could afford. Kale's face changed with each sentence, but she did not stop. That night only showed me what had already been true for months. I was never your partner. I was the price you were willing to pay for land. I am asking you to come back, Kale said, and this time the words carried no royal command. Lysandra looked at him carefully. As what? He frowned. My wife, or the Moonborn keeping your kingdom alive? The question cut straight through him. Kale hesitated, only for a second, but it was enough. Lysandra's eyes filled before she could stop them. She hated that the answer still hurt. You do not even know, she whispered. That is the worst part. Kyle reached toward her, but she stepped back. Rowan moved slightly, not interfering, merely making it clear she would not stand alone if Kale forgot himself. Kale noticed. For the first time, Lysandra saw jealousy in his face, not romantic jealousy alone, but the shock of realizing another alpha could stand beside her without trying to own her. The attack came before sunset. Lysandra's small party had barely descended from the temple when the first arrow struck the horse beside Mira. The animal screamed and collapsed, throwing her hard onto the frozen ground. Men in Frostfang colors exploded from the tree line, blades drawn, their faces masked. Rowan cursed immediately. Those are not my soldiers. Kale shifted before anyone else, his wolf surging beneath his skin as he intercepted the first attacker. Steel rang against steel. Snow churned red beneath boots and claws. Lysandra dragged Mira behind a stone outcrop and pressed cloth against the wound in her shoulder. Then she heard a child scream. A family of pilgrims had been climbing toward the temple when the ambush began. One little boy stood frozen in the open while an assassin raised a sword behind him. Lysandra ran before fear could stop her. She threw herself between the child and the blade. The sword came down. Something ancient inside her broke open. Silver light erupted from her body with such force that the assassin flew backward and struck a pine tree hard enough to crack the trunk. The entire mountainside flashed white. Moonstones buried beneath the snow awakened in a line stretching toward the temple. Wolves' Kales, Rowans, Even the attackers dropped to their knees or bellies as though compelled by an older instinct than obedience to any alpha. Lysandra stood in the center of the light with the child clinging to her skirts, her eyes glowing pale silver. She could hear the land, not as words, but as thousands of heartbeats pressing into her bones. For the first time in her life, she understood why her mother had been afraid for her. Cale stared from several yards away, blood running down one side of his face. Shock stripped every trace of arrogance from him. The woman he had told would have nowhere to go stood beneath a storm of silver light while seasoned warriors bowed without being ordered. Lysandra met his eyes. She saw the recognition land inside him with almost physical force. He had married a woman he thought powerless and discovered too late that she carried an authority his crown could never command. The light slowly faded, leaving the forest unnaturally still. Rowan's men secured the surviving attackers. Most had killed themselves rather than be captured, but one lay wounded against a rock, unable to reach the poison hidden inside his sleeve. Cale dragged the assassin upright by the collar. "Who sent you?" The man spat blood and laughed. "You already know." Cale slammed him against the stone. "Say the name." The assassin's face tightened. "Malrek Vera." Lysandra felt Mira's fingers clutch her sleeve. Cale went still. "And Seraphine?" The man hesitated. That hesitation was answer enough, but Cale demanded it aloud. "Did she know?" The assassin swallowed. "She knew the Moonborn had to die before." A sharp whistle cut through the forest. The man jerked violently. An arrow burst through his throat. Blood sprayed across Cale's hand. For half a second everyone froze. Then Rowan pointed toward the ridge. A mounted archer was already turning his horse. Cale's beta tackled him before he could escape. The man fought wildly, but when they tore away his cloak, a silver emblem flashed beneath it, the private crest of Seraphine Vera. Cale stared at the symbol as though it belonged to a stranger. Something in his face finally broke. Not because Malrek had betrayed him. Perhaps some part of him had begun to suspect that already. It was Seraphine, the woman he had defended against Lysandra, the woman for whom he had sacrificed his wife's dignity, the woman he had allowed to sleep in the bridal chamber while Lysandra rode alone into the night. Cale looked down at the crest in his hand, and Lysandra saw the exact moment regret became horror. They rode for Blackthorn before darkness fully fell. Cale pushed his horse nearly to collapse, Rowan and Lysandra following because the surviving assassin had carried another message ordering loyalists inside the palace to act before the king returned. Smoke appeared on the horizon long before the walls came into view. Blackthorn's banners had been lowered from the western towers. In their place flew the black and silver crest of House Vera. The outer gates were closed against their own king. Soldiers stood above the walls with bows raised. Cale pulled his horse to a violent stop. A herald stepped onto the battlement and unrolled a decree. "By authority of the High Council," he shouted into the night, "Cale Draven is suspended from the Alpha Throne pending judgment for surrendering Blackthorn to Moonborn influence." Cale's face went white with fury. The herald continued, "Grand Elder Malrek Vera now holds emergency command." Then the palace doors high above the city opened. Seraphine stepped onto the royal balcony wearing a silver crown. Lysandra recognized it instantly. It was the Luna crown, and Seraphine was smiling. Blackthorn was already bleeding before Lysandra crossed its gates. Smoke crawled above the rooftops in dark ribbons, war bells hammered through the night, and frightened families pressed themselves against shuttered windows, while soldiers wearing the same crest aimed blades at one another in the streets below. From the ridge, Lysandra could see Seraphine standing on the royal balcony beneath a stolen silver crown, her body framed by torchlight as though she had already won. Beside her stood Malrek Vera, calm, composed, almost serene in the middle of a kingdom tearing itself apart. Cale sat rigid on his horse beside Lysandra, but for once his rage did not frighten her. What frightened her was the city beneath them. There were children inside those walls who had never watched her humiliation. Mothers who had never laughed when her wedding chest was thrown into the corridor. Men dying because powerful people had mistaken pride for duty. Lysandra realized then that justice would demand more from her than revenge ever could. Cale rode toward the sealed gate until arrows lifted above him. "Open it," he commanded, and for the first time in his life the order sounded as though it had struck an invisible wall. Some guards flinched, but none obeyed. The damaged Alpha Bond had weakened his authority, and Malrek knew it. He appeared above the battlement and called down that Cale had abandoned Blackthorn to chase a runaway wife. that he had returned with Frostfang soldiers and a Moonborn woman whose bloodline threatened the throne. Every sentence was designed to wound a different part of him. Kael's fingers tightened around the reins. Days ago, he would have answered humiliation with violence. This time his gaze moved past Malrek toward the civilians trapped behind the walls. "If I force my way in, they die first," he said. The admission was quiet, almost bitter. Lysandra looked at him. He was beginning, finally, to understand that power meant very little when every choice crushed someone weaker. Rowan warned that storming the gate would turn Malrek's lie into truth. Kael wanted to go in alone. Lysandra stopped him. "You still think every disaster can be solved by putting your body in front of it?" His eyes flashed, but she continued. "That is not sacrifice if it only creates another corpse people must fight over." For several seconds they stared at one another. Then Kael asked a question that would once have been impossible for him. "What would you do?" Lysandra felt the weight of it. Not because she needed his permission, but because this was the first time he had asked for her judgment before making a decision. She looked toward the ancient moonstone above the gate, lifted the crescent medallion beneath her cloak, and watched the stone answer with one weak pulse. "I would enter as Moonborn," she said. "Not as your wife." Kael lowered his head. "Then that is how you will enter." Eloin led them through an abandoned tunnel beneath the northern cliffs, a passage carved long before the current throne had been built. The deeper Lysandra walked beneath Blackthorn, the more clearly she felt the kingdom's suffering. Broken wards trembled beneath the soil like torn veins. Frightened wolves shifted restlessly inside homes because they could no longer feel the alpha bond that had guided them since childhood. Each fracture in the land seemed to echo through the crescent mark beneath her skin. By the time they emerged inside the lower city, Lysandra's breath had shortened. A woman hiding beside a burned market stall recognized Kael first and recoiled. Then her eyes found Lysandra. She clutched a crying infant against her chest and whispered, "Please, whatever the palace did to you, do not let our children pay for it." Lysandra froze. That sentence entered deeper than any insult Seraphine had ever thrown at her. She had imagined returning to Blackthorn many times after leaving. In some versions, she watched the palace fall. In others, Kael stood alone among the ruins and finally understood what he had done. Those fantasies had been easy because they contained no faces, no frightened mothers, no wounded boys trying to carry younger sisters through smoke. Revenge was simple when suffering remained abstract. Now, Lysandra understood why her mother had hidden the Moonborn blood instead of using it to conquer. Real power was not the ability to destroy the people who had wronged you. It was the ability to separate them from the innocent people standing behind them. She turned to Kael. "I am not doing this for you." His face tightened, but he nodded. "I know." Lysandra almost hated the gentleness of the answer. If he had learned to say those two words before their wedding night, perhaps she would never have had to learn how much strength it took to leave him. They entered the great hall through the eastern service doors and found 20 Moonvale residents chained before the council. Old merchants, kitchen servants, 2 elderly women, several children. One little girl had dried blood in her hair. Seraphine sat on the Luna chair wearing Lysandra's silver cloak, one hand resting on the carved armrest, as though she had been born there. She smiled when Lysandra appeared, but the smile died almost immediately. Moonstones embedded in the floor awakened beneath Lysandra's feet, silver light following every step she took toward the center of the hall. The stones surrounding Seraphine remained dead. Silence spread through the council. It was not admiration, it was recognition. The room itself knew which woman belonged to the ancient covenant, and Seraphine knew it too. Still, Seraphine could not resist striking where she believed Lysandra remained weakest. "So you came back," she said, "after all that pride." Her eyes slid toward Kael. "Do not mistake this for love, Lysandra. He did not chase you because he suddenly discovered your worth. His walls began dying. His soldiers began losing their bond. His throne cracked. That is when you became precious to him." The cruelty of the words came from their truth. Lysandra felt them land. Kael did too. He looked toward her, but this time she did not spare him from what he had earned. Seraphine smiled again. "He is not afraid of losing you. He is afraid of losing everything you can give him." Lysandra's chest tightened because that was exactly the question she had asked at the temple, and Kael had not known how to answer. Malrek interrupted before the silence could turn against them. He called the Moonborn records forgeries and accused Lysandra of conspiring with Frostfang to seize Blackthorn. Lysandra did not raise her voice. She simply placed Althea's ledger on the council table, then the original military letters, then the altered copies bearing Malrek's seal, then the assassin's crest taken from Seraphine's own archer. One by one, the objects struck the wood with the finality of stones being placed over a grave. Elowin authenticated the seals. Rowan produced Frostfang accounts showing payments to Malrek's intermediaries. An elderly elder named Garrick finally stood, hands trembling, and confessed that years ago he had seen Malrek dismiss 2 royal couriers carrying Althea's warnings. Fear had kept him silent. That silence, he admitted, had helped bury innocent people. Kael listened without moving. The truth about his parents' deaths hollowed something out of him, but Lysandra could see another realization cutting even deeper. Malrek had manipulated him, yes, but Malrek had not been inside the bridal chamber. Malrek had not grabbed Lysandra's wrist. Malrek had not ordered her to apologize to Seraphine. Those choices belonged to Kael alone. When Seraphine rushed toward him, crying that her father had forced her to cooperate, Kael caught her hands before they reached his chest. She looked relieved for half a second, believing old habit would save her. Then he removed her hands and stepped away. "Did you know men were sent to kill Lysandra?" Seraphine hesitated. "Kael, I was afraid." "Did you know?" His voice was quieter now. The hall leaned toward the answer. Seraphine looked at Malrek. That glance condemned her. "Arrest her," Kael said. Seraphine stared at him as if he had struck her. "After everything I gave you?" she screamed. "I stayed beside you through war. I loved you before she even knew your name." Kael's eyes closed briefly. When he opened them, there was no tenderness left. "And because of that, I kept forgiving things. I should have stopped. I called cruelty loyalty because it was convenient." Then he turned toward Lysandra. The entire hall watched. "Malrek lied to me. Seraphine manipulated me. But neither of them forced me to watch you bleed and ask you to apologize. Neither forced me to use Moonveil's weakness as a chain around your neck. I knew you were being humiliated. I chose political comfort over your dignity." His voice broke slightly on the last word. "That part was me." Lysandra had dreamed of hearing him admit it. She had imagined satisfaction. Instead, grief rose so suddenly she nearly lost her breath. Because this was the Kael she had wanted on their wedding night, the man capable of seeing the truth, naming his own failure, standing before others and refusing to hide behind power. He had arrived too late. That was what hurt. People often imagined regret as something beautiful, but sometimes regret was simply proof that the person who destroyed you had always been capable of doing better. He had just not believed you were worth the effort until after you left. Lysandra looked away before anyone could see the tears gathering in her eyes. Malrek saw the council slipping from him and moved with the desperation of a man whose power had always depended on fear. He seized the nearest Moonveil child and pressed a dagger to her throat. The little girl whimpered. Every weapon in the hall lifted. "Come closer, and she dies." Lysandra raised one hand. To her surprise, warriors from both factions stopped. Malrek noticed it too. Fear crossed his face. "You think this makes you a queen?" he spat. "Your mother believed herself untouchable." Lysandra's blood went cold. "What did you do to her?" Malrek's smile returned, thin and poisonous. "I made certain history moved forward." That admission shattered the final uncertainty. Althea had not simply died hiding. Malrek had hunted her until there was nowhere left to run. Kael moved first. Malrek threw the child aside and fled through the side passage as guards collided around him. Seraphine tried to run after her father, but one of the maids she had beaten stepped directly into her path. The delay lasted only a second, but it was enough for 2 soldiers to seize Seraphine by the arms. She screamed Kael's name. He never turned. Then a sound rolled beneath the palace so deep that every candle flame bent. A crack tore through the central moonstone. The war bells began immediately. 1, 2, 3, Northern Breach. A captain burst into the hall with blood soaking one side of his armor. "The barrier is gone. Rogue packs crossed the northern farms. Hundreds, perhaps more." Another messenger followed with news that the western ward had collapsed. Outside the high windows, the moon rose red through the smoke. Elowin rushed to the broken central stone and pressed both hands against it. Her face drained of color. "The blood moon is amplifying every fracture in the covenant." Kael turned toward her. "Can it be restored?" Elowin looked at Lysandra. The room followed her gaze. Seraphine laughed bitterly from between her guards. "There. Now he needs you enough to kneel." The words hit Kael harder than anyone expected. He stared at Seraphine, then at Lysandra. Slowly he walked toward the throne. For one terrible moment, Lysandra thought he intended to sit upon it and command her again. Instead, KL reached for the black crown resting beside the seat. He lifted it with both hands. The hall fell silent. That crown had survived assassinations, civil wars, and generations of Alpha Kings, who would rather die than bow before another ruler. Kale carried it down the steps and placed it on the stone floor between himself and Lysandra. Then he knelt. No one breathed. Lysandra looked down at him and was thrown violently back into the memory of their wedding corridor. Kale standing behind Seraphine. Kale telling her not to embarrass him over a bed. Kale saying she would still be there in the morning because she had nowhere else to go. Now that same man knelt before the woman he had once treated as incapable of leaving him. Yet the sight did not heal her. It hurt in a new place. She had wanted him to choose her when standing beside her cost him almost nothing. Now he was choosing her because everything was burning. Seraphine gave a broken laugh. Look at him, Lysandra. He is not kneeling because he loves you. He is kneeling because his kingdom is dying. Kale did not deny it. That silence made Lysandra's eyes sting. He looked up at her. She is right about one thing. Blackthorn is dying, and if I told you I would be on my knees tonight if the kingdom were safe, I would be lying. The honesty struck harder than a beautiful declaration could have. I came after you because the walls failed. I understood your power before I understood your pain. That is another shame I will have to live with. His voice grew rough. But what I do now is not payment for your return. KL took a sealed parchment from his commander and placed it beside the crown. Moon Valley returns to Moonvale tonight. Not if you save Blackthorn. Tonight. Your territory will be recognized as sovereign, whether you help us or leave us to face this without you. Every law that allows an alpha to force a political mate into marriage will be repealed. Malrek and Seraphine will face public judgment. And our marriage, his throat tightened, our marriage ends the moment you ask for freedom. Even if you walk through those doors after signing and never speak my name again. Lysandra could not look away. Kale continued. I will not ask you to come back to my bed. I will not ask you to love me. I will not insult you by asking forgiveness while people are screaming outside. I am asking one thing only. His eyes were red now, whether from exhaustion or something deeper she could not tell. Save the people who never hurt you. If there must be a price for what I did, let me pay it afterward. That was the moment something inside Lysandra nearly broke again, not because she forgave him, but because he had finally understood the shape of repentance. Real regret did not demand a reward. It did not say, I changed, therefore you owe me another chance. It accepted that some wounds could be apologized for and still remain permanent. She bent, lifted the parchment, and read every line. KL's signature was already there. There were no hidden conditions. No clause returning Moon Valley if she refused him. He had surrendered leverage before knowing her answer. I will save Blackthorn, Lysandra said. KL closed his eyes. But do not mistake that for forgiveness. I won't. I am doing this for the woman holding her baby in the lower city, for the children chained in this hall, for every soldier outside who inherited our mistakes. I know. Again those words. I know. So small, and still almost enough to make her hate him for learning them too late. They descended to the moon altar, while the palace shook around them. Outside, the sounds of battle had become constant. Wolves snarling, steel striking stone, women screaming names into smoke. The central moonstone was split from top to bottom. Aloan positioned Lysandra on one side and Kale on the other. The Old Covenant requires the Moonborn to open the land and the Alpha to anchor the pack. Lysandra placed her palm against the stone. Silverlight immediately climbed her arm. Kale placed his hand opposite hers. For one breath, the altar glowed. Then the light vanished. A shockwave threw Kale backward. Aloan stared at the stone in horror. Again, they tried. Nothing. Kale looked at Lysandra. She saw the answer dawning in his face before Aloan spoke. The covenant is not a spell, the priestess whispered. It cannot be forced by blood, title, or need. The Moonborn must trust the Alpha beside her enough to open the bond willingly. The battle outside seemed to disappear from Lysandra's hearing. Kale slowly lowered his hand. He did not ask her to try harder. He did not tell her thousands would die because of her hesitation. He simply looked at the dead moonstone, and the truth entered him completely. I did this, he said. Lysandra's throat tightened. Kale laughed once, but there was no humor in it. I spent years believing loyalty could be demanded. 3 days believing a marriage vow meant you could not leave. One night proving to you that my word meant nothing. He looked at her then, and there was such naked grief in his face that she had to fight the instinct to look away. And now an entire kingdom needs the one thing I cannot command you to give me. Trust. The word remained unspoken between them. Outside, another tower collapsed with a sound like thunder. Lysandra turned toward the window and saw Blackthorn burning beneath the blood-red moon. Behind her stood a king who could surrender land, laws, pride, and even his marriage. But the one thing the kingdom needed had died in a bridal chamber 3 nights earlier, when he watched another woman tear a chain from Lysandra's throat and chose silence. For the first time in his life, Alpha King Kael Draven understood that there were losses no crown could order returned, and Blackthorn had only hours left to survive his lesson. The next explosion shook dust from the moon altar ceiling, but Kael did not ask Lysandra to try the covenant again. That silence frightened her more than another command would have. He stood before the dead moonstone with blood on his sleeve, smoke drifting through the broken windows behind him, and finally looked like a man who understood that regret did not erase consequences. "You owe me nothing," he said, almost as if the words hurt to force past his throat. Not trust, not forgiveness, not another attempt. Lysandra stared at him, stunned by the absence of pressure. Outside, wolves screamed beyond the inner wall. Kael turned toward the doors. "If Blackthorn falls tonight, it will not fall because you refused me. It will fall because I spent too long believing that what belonged to another person could still be commanded by a king." Then he walked away from the altar and toward the battle, leaving Lysandra with the one thing he had never truly given her before, a choice without punishment attached to it. Kael reached the lower courtyard as the northern barricade collapsed. Rogue wolves poured through the breach in waves, driven half-mad by the blood moon and the broken wards. Blackthorn soldiers fought shoulder to shoulder in the smoke, some unable to hear their commanders through the shattered pack bond. Kael shifted in the middle of them, his black wolf tearing into the first attackers before they could reach the refugee line. He did not fight like a king defending a throne anymore. He fought like a man buying seconds for children he might never live to see safe. Lysandra watched from the upper stairs, something painful tightening beneath her ribs. This was the Kael she had hoped existed before their wedding, the man who would stand between danger and the vulnerable. Yet every act of courage now came wrapped in a cruel question. Why had he needed to lose her before becoming someone worthy of the faith she once offered freely? A scream rose from the western passage. Mira came running through the smoke, one arm still bound from the earlier attack. Malrek escaped the holding chamber. Lysandra's blood went cold. "Seraphine?" Mira shook her head. She helped him. Before Lysandra could answer, a horn sounded from the old armory yard. Malrek appeared above the stone steps with 6 frightened Moonvale children chained together before him. His coat was torn, one side of his face streaked with blood, yet arrogance still clung to him like armor. Seraphine stood beside him without her false crown, wild-eyed and furious, gripping a short blade. "Call off the soldiers!" Malrek shouted, pressing his sword beneath the chin of the eldest boy. "Or Moonvale begins losing heirs, one child at a time." Lysandra stopped so suddenly that Rowan nearly collided with her. The entire courtyard seemed to narrow around those children. Kael shifted back into human form several yards away, blood running from a bite across his ribs. His gaze moved from the children to Malrek, then to Lysandra. He did not speak for her. He did not command her to surrender. That, more than anything, showed how much had changed. Seraphine, however, looked at Lysandra and smiled with broken hatred. "Do you see what your precious dignity bought you?" she shouted. "A city burning, children chained, a king bleeding because you needed to prove you could walk away." The accusation struck exactly where Seraphine intended, but Lysandra no longer allowed another woman to define the meaning of her choices. "No," she answered, her voice steady despite the terror in her chest. "This is what your hunger to replace me bought. Do not confuse the consequences of your cruelty with the cost of my freedom." Malrek began backing toward the western gate, dragging the children with him. Kael moved one step. Malrek immediately cut the boy's neck shallowly, enough for blood to appear. Another step and I open his throat. Kael froze. Lysandra felt the Moonborn power inside her stirring, but the broken covenant made it unstable. One uncontrolled burst might kill the very children she was trying to protect. Rowan whispered that archers had no clean shot. Malrek knew it. His smile returned. For decades, he had survived by understanding exactly how much innocent blood powerful people were willing to risk. Then one of the youngest girls stumbled. Malrek cursed and raised his sword as if to strike her for slowing him down. Kale moved before anyone could stop him. He crossed the distance in a blur. Malrek shoved the child forward and drove his sword toward her back. Kale turned his body between them. The blade entered beneath his ribs. Lysandra heard the sound before she understood what she was seeing. Kale staggered, one hand closing around the steel protruding from his side, while the little girl fell safely against his chest. Malrek ripped the sword free. Kale collapsed to one knee. For one terrible moment, Lysandra was back in the bridal corridor again, watching him choose someone else, but this time, the person he had chosen to protect was one of hers, a frightened Moonvale child who could give him nothing in return. The difference broke through something she had been holding rigid inside herself. Not forgiveness, not yet, but certainty. Kale had finally made a choice that cost him more than pride. Rowan's warriors surged forward. Malrek tried to flee, but Kale, barely conscious, caught his ankle and dragged him down long enough for the guards to seize him. Seraphine screamed at her father to help her. Malrek turned once, looked at his own daughter surrounded by soldiers, and then tried to crawl away without her. Seraphine's face changed as the truth reached her. Everything she had done, the lies, the humiliation, the attempted murder, the stolen crown had been for a father who would abandon her the moment she became inconvenient. "Father!" she shrieked. Malrek never looked back. For the first time, Seraphine was forced to feel what she had spent years inflicting on others. The terror of discovering that devotion meant nothing to the person whose approval had ruled her life. Lysandra dropped beside Kale. Blood spread rapidly beneath her hands as she pressed against the wound. His eyes opened with difficulty. "The children?" he asked. Not the throne, not the barrier, not Seraphine. The children. Lysandra swallowed hard. Safe. Relief passed over his face. He tried to sit up and failed. "Go." She stared at him. "You are bleeding to death. And Blackthorn is still dying." His fingers closed weakly around her wrist, then immediately loosened as though even now he feared holding her without permission. "Do not save me because you think you owe me. Save them because that is who you are." Tears burned behind Lysandra's eyes. It would have been easier if he had begged. Easier if he had tried to turn his wound into another chain around her heart. Instead, Kale was releasing her even while dying. Lysandra returned to the moon altar alone. Elowyn tried to follow, but Lysandra raised one hand. No, the old covenant failed because it was built around the idea that a Moonborn must trust an alpha before the land will listen. Perhaps that was necessary once. It is not what I choose now. She placed both palms against the cracked moonstone. Pain raced through her arms. The land opened beneath her awareness, the rivers, the forests, the frightened wolves, the broken towers, even the blood soaking the courtyard stones. She understood suddenly that the Covenant had never been asking her to forgive Kale. It had been asking whether she would surrender herself to the same structure that had allowed him to believe possession was love. Lysandra closed her eyes. "Then the old Covenant ends with me." Silver light erupted through the altar. Across Blackthorn, every moonstone ignited. Lysandra spoke into the power beneath the land, not as Kael's wife, not as a rejected bride, but as the last Moonborn heir. "No alpha shall claim Aluna's power through marriage alone. No bond shall survive humiliation by force. No throne shall own the blood that protects it. From this night forward, Blackthorn and Moonvale stand beside each other by consent, or they do not stand together at all." The cracked altar screamed beneath her hands. For a moment, Lysandra thought the entire temple would collapse. Then the fracture sealed with a line of white fire. Outside, the broken northern barrier surged upward in a wall of silver light. Rogue wolves were thrown backward from the city. The pack bond returned like thunder through every Blackthorn warrior. The blood moon began to fade. By sunrise, Blackthorn still stood. Kale did too, barely. He survived the night after healers worked for hours to close the wound Malrek had given him. When he woke 2 days later, the first document placed beside his bed was not a military report. It was the decree he had signed before kneeling to Lysandra. Moonvale was sovereign. The forced marriage statutes were already being removed from Blackthorn law. He read each line, then asked for one more document. When Lysandra entered the chamber later that afternoon, she found the dissolution of their political marriage, waiting on the table, already bearing Kale's signature. He looked pale, weaker than she had ever seen him. But there was no attempt to use that weakness against her. "You said once I believed you had nowhere else to go," he said. I will never put you in that position again. The trials began when Kale could stand. Malrek was brought into the great hall in iron chains, no ceremonial robes, no council seat, no title spoken before his name. The charges took nearly an hour to read. Treason, forged military intelligence, conspiracy leading to the deaths of Kale's parents, persecution of the Moonborn line, attempted murder, hostage-taking, and rebellion against the crown. Every witness he had once silenced was allowed to speak. Every ledger he had hidden was opened. Malrek tried to blame necessity, war, and the weakness of former kings, but no one lowered their eyes anymore. The man who had spent half his life controlling rooms through fear discovered that fear disappeared quickly when people realized he no longer possessed the power to punish them. Seraphine's judgment came afterward, and hers was quieter but no less devastating. She was brought into the same bridal corridor where Lysandra's wedding chest had been thrown onto the floor. The palace servants had gathered there not because Lysandra ordered them to watch, but because many had suffered beneath Seraphine for years. One by one, every symbol she had stolen was removed. The silver Luna cloak came from her shoulders. The ceremonial bracelets were taken from her wrists. The jeweled clasp she had worn during Lysandra's humiliation was unfastened from her dress. Seraphine looked toward Kale for rescue out of habit. He stood beside the council and did not move. This time, his silence protected the woman she had hurt, not the woman doing the hurting. When the guards opened the door to the former Luna chamber, Seraphine saw that it had been emptied, not given to Lysandra, not preserved as a trophy, simply emptied. Her face twisted. "Where am I supposed to sleep?" she demanded, the question bursting from her before pride could stop it. The corridor went still. Mira looked at Lysandra, remembering another night, another woman, the same cruelty reversed by circumstance. Lysandra could have answered with the words that had once cut her open. She could have said, "Sleep somewhere else." Instead, she looked at Seraphine with a calm that hurt far more. "That is no longer my concern." Seraphine was taken away, stripped of title and privilege, sentenced to exile beyond Blackthorn's protected territories after serving years of confinement for her role in the attempted assassination. Lysandra returned to Moonvale before the first winter snow. She did not leave as a discarded bride this time. She rode beneath banners carrying her own crescent crest while hundreds lined the road not to welcome an Alpha King's wife, but the sovereign Luna who had restored their homeland's independence. Moon Valley reopened under Moonvale control. Villages abandoned during the old wars were rebuilt. Lysandra established a council where Luna, widows, healers, and women from minor packs could petition without requiring an alpha's permission. The first law she signed declared that no political marriage could transfer land, inheritance, or magical bonds without continued consent from both partners. She did not write Kale's name anywhere in the law. She did not need to. Some lessons became stronger when they outlived the people who caused them. Months passed before Kale came to Moonvale. There was no royal procession, no army, no black crown. He arrived on one horse wearing a simple dark cloak and waited outside the lakeside hall until Lysandra agreed to see him. When she stepped onto the terrace, he did not reach for her. "I wanted to tell you Blackthorn has passed the final reforms," he said, "and that Malrek's remaining loyalists have been removed from the council." Lysandra nodded. Silence stretched between them, filled with everything neither could undo. Finally, Kale said, "I do not expect you to come back." "Good." A faint, wounded smile touched his mouth. "I was hoping you might allow me to walk with you." Lysandra looked toward the lake. Once, she would have mistaken the ache in her chest for proof that love required surrender. Now she understood better. Loving someone did not erase what they had done. Forgiving them did not automatically restore the place they once held. Trust could return, perhaps, but only slowly, only voluntarily, and only if both people were willing to live differently from the ones who had broken it. "One walk," she said. Kale nodded as though she had granted him something sacred. They walked beside the water without touching. No vows, no promises, no crown between them. For the first time since they met, Kale stood beside Lysandra because she had allowed him to, and nothing else. If this story has kept you with Lysandra through humiliation, betrayal, and the moment she finally reclaimed her own life, stay with us for more stories where the ones who are underestimated rise, the powerful are forced to face what they have done, and justice never arrives quietly. That night long ago, Seraphine had believed victory meant occupying another woman's bed. Kale had believed power meant ensuring his wife had nowhere else to go. Both had been wrong. Lysandra's greatest victory was never reclaiming the bridal chamber, the Luna cloak, or even the man who had failed her. It was reaching the point where none of those things determined her worth. The woman once ordered to sleep somewhere else became the woman who decided where she belonged, which kingdom deserved her loyalty, and who, if anyone, was worthy of standing beside her. And KL finally learned the lesson no Alpha Crown had ever taught him. Love demanded freely was loyalty. Love demanded by power was only another form of captivity.